Burkina Faso just broke every rule. Soldiers who came back with shattered bodies are not begging in silence. They're turning rifles into plows, raising poultry instead of pain, and feeding the nation with the same hands that once carried guns. But here's the shock that flips the logic. The very leader behind this dignity project just killed his own electoral commission. Yes, the same referee that was supposed to keep elections clean. One hand grows food, the other hand rips ballots. And the twist cuts even deeper. The West preaches freedom, but Libya had free hospitals before democracy. Burkina now dares to test the same gamble, trading ballots for bread, sovereignty for survival. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments. And be honest. If your government gave you two choices, would you fight for your country or would you farm for it? This is Africa Daily. Good news. A channel built to connect Africa's raw reality with the American screen. To remind us that sovereignty isn't just policy, it's a choice every nation makes, whether Washington likes it or not. So hit subscribe, like, share. Not because I ask, but because these are stories the big networks won't dare to tell. And tonight, we start in Burkina Faso, where soldiers once written off as broken are quietly rewriting what it means to serve a nation. A country at war usually counts its wounded as losses, statistics, or forgotten names on a list. But Burkina Faso just did something that breaks that logic. Soldiers who lost limbs, eyesight, or strength in battle are being sent back. Not to the front, not to a hospital bed to fade away, but to the fields. Farming, poultry production, even agribusiness training. It sounds almost absurd at first. How do you turn men who once carried rifles into men who now raise chickens? Yet that absurdity is exactly what makes this moment powerful. The government launched a program to reintegrate injured military personnel and young volunteers into agriculture. On paper, it looks simple. Teach them to plant, to manage small farms, to create food security. But underneath, it is a radical shift in how a nation treats its fighters. For decades, across Africa and beyond, the wounded from war have been discarded. In Congo, for example, veterans often return home to nothing, leaving their families to beg or even fall into prostitution just to survive. Burkina Faso is saying, not here, not anymore. And if you think about it, there's something profoundly human in this. Most people, whether in America, Europe, or Africa, fear losing purpose more than losing comfort. A U.S. veteran might tell you the hardest part isn't the wound itself, but waking up with no mission, no reason to stand. By giving disabled fighters land to till, animals to raise, or produce to sell, Burkina is giving them what every human craves: dignity. Consider the image. A man who once carried a weapon now bends down to plant maize. He sweats, not from fear of an ambush, but from building rows of food that will feed his own children and neighbors. He goes from a symbol of destruction to a symbol of life. That transformation is not just practical, it reshapes how citizens see their military. No longer only men with guns, but men with tools, adding to society rather than only defending it. It's tempting to think this is charity, but maybe it's smarter than that. A hungry nation is weak, a fed nation can resist. Soldiers turned farmers reduce imports, strengthen sovereignty, and shift the psychology of war. And for ordinary people, the message is clear. Service doesn't end when the battle wounds arrive. Service changes form. In fact, research on human resilience shows people thrive most when they can turn trauma into contribution. Americans see it in how veterans start businesses or lead community groups after coming home. Burkina is scripting its own version, one that fits its soil and its scars. Of course, behind every field and chicken coop lies the question, who created the war that made these men broken in the first place? That shadow lingers. Yet before we confront it, we need to stay with this picture a little longer. The soldier with missing fingers planting seeds, his uniform traded for dusty work clothes. Because in that paradox of loss becoming renewal, Burkina Faso has planted more than crops. It has planted a symbol of resistance. And from that soil of recovery, another storm begins to rise, one that questions not the battlefield, but the ballot box. A nation that feeds its wounded sounds inspiring, but here's the contradiction that unsettles many. The same Burkina Faso that plants dignity in the soil just uprooted its own electoral commission. In one move, Ibrahim Traoré dissolved the very institution designed to safeguard the ballot box. For the outside world, that smells like dictatorship. For his supporters, it feels like sovereignty reclaimed. The official reason: cost and control. The commission required nearly $870,000 a year, while also drawing funds and technical assistance from the European Union, France, and the United States. For a country where schools crumble and orphans wait for help, leaders argue that money is better spent at home. Yet critics fire back without an independent referee who ensures fair play when the next election comes. Imagine a basketball game where the referee is also the captain of one team. Would any American accept that? But then another layer unfolds. Independence, Traoré insists, means no foreign fingerprints on Burkina Faso's choices. And it's true. The so-called Independent Commission was stitched together with civil society, political parties, religious groups, and foreign funding. To him, that meant sovereignty on paper but not in practice. To cancel it was not sabotage, it was surgery. Whether you agree depends on how much you trust the surgeon. There's a human side to this dilemma that often gets lost in headlines. Most people, whether in Africa or America, dislike the feeling of being watched by outsiders when making family decisions. If an American town council were funded by Beijing or Moscow, many would scream foreign interference. So why is it so shocking when an African leader says the same about Paris or Brussels? The difference, of course, is history. In Africa, interference has never really stopped. It only changed uniforms. One short story makes the paradox sharper. A Burkinabe widow whose husband died fighting insurgents once told a journalist, "He died for a country that never let him vote, but at least now my children eat." Her words capture the painful trade-off: bread on the table versus ballots in the box. For her, survival outweighed procedure. For others, procedure is survival itself. Both are right depending on where you sit. And this is where it stings for Western audiences. Americans often assume democracy is the universal cure. Yet research shows most citizens value stability above all. In surveys, when people fear hunger or violence, their willingness to trade away voting rights rises dramatically. If you've ever skipped voting because the line was long or the weather was bad, imagine how quickly people in war zones recalculate priorities when bullets replace ballots. So Burkina Faso stands on a knife's edge, a leader feeding soldiers while stripping institutions, a people who crave both bread and ballots but may not get both. And that uneasy balance sets the stage for the next question. Who really profits when war drags on and when the enemies at the gates arrive better armed than the state itself? Terrorists with drones. This is the image that makes no sense at first sight. How can ragtag fighters hiding in the Sahel suddenly own surveillance gear, night vision goggles, and explosives more advanced than what some national armies carry? Burkina Faso accuses France of playing both firefighter and arsonist. Light the house on fire, then charge rent to bring the water. The claim may sound extreme, but it explains why suspicion lingers whenever foreign soldiers arrive with promises to help. And here lies a darker irony. For decades, French troops were stationed in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, supposedly to protect. Yet year after year, the attacks only grew deadlier. When Paris finally left, the violence did not vanish. It morphed. Fighters who once came on motorbikes now track soldiers with commercial drones, hitting targets with uncanny precision. If you're watching this from the United States, ask yourself, how would it feel if drug cartels in Mexico suddenly flew drones over Texas patrols? Would you believe the weapons appeared out of thin air? Or would you wonder who sold them? Who trained them? Burkina Faso's answer was to no longer wait for outsiders. The army fights, yes, but so do volunteers known as VDPs, ordinary men and women, trained just enough to defend their towns when insurgents arrive. Picture a farmer in the morning holding a hoe. At night, he patrols the same field with a rifle. That double life changes the psychology of an entire community. Once passive victims, they now carry a fragile sense of control. But control comes with cost. Families lose fathers, mothers, cousins. Trauma becomes a neighbor you cannot avoid. There is a human story that captures this paradox. A young Burkinabe man, only 19, dropped out of school to join the VDPs after militants raided his village. He told a reporter, "If I die, at least my sisters will sleep." Later, he was wounded, too injured to fight again. Under the new program, he was placed in an agricultural training center, learning poultry farming. His hands that once held an old Kalashnikov now weigh feed for chickens. For him, the battlefield never really ended. It just turned into rows of cages and coops. That is both tragedy and redemption in the same breath. And it raises a question we rarely want to face. Are these citizens being empowered or simply used until they break, then recycled? Human beings crave purpose, but purpose without rest becomes exploitation. Americans often talk about burnout in offices. Imagine that multiplied on battlefields. If people in peaceful suburbs can collapse from emails and deadlines, what happens to those balancing war by night and farming by day? Yet Burkina Faso presses forward. The state argues that dignity comes not from handouts but from contribution. Maybe they're right. Maybe sovereignty in the Sahel means creating soldiers who can also be farmers, and farmers who can also be soldiers. It's messy, it's human, and it is far from the neat definitions written in Western policy papers. From this uneasy battlefield of drones and volunteer militias, another question begins to surface. If outside powers aren't the solution, why do they always seem to hold the keys to Africa's survival? Democracy is supposed to be untouchable, yet Burkina Faso just treated it like an optional expense. The government dissolved its independent electoral commission, citing the price tag, about $870,000 a year, and the uncomfortable fact that much of its funding came from France, the European Union, and the United States. To Western ears, that sounds like dismantling the very guardrails of freedom. To supporters on the ground, it sounded like cutting the strings of a puppet. The contradiction is hard to ignore. How can a nation claim to fight for sovereignty while at the same time removing the very mechanism meant to protect citizens' voices? The answer depends on where you sit. If you're in Washington, it feels like tyranny. If you're in Ouagadougou, it feels like finally shutting the door on outsiders who have refereed African politics for decades. Ask yourself honestly, would Americans tolerate an election commission in New York paid for by Beijing? But then another layer emerges. By abolishing the commission, power to run elections shifts to the Interior Ministry, a branch under Traoré's own government. That blurs the line between independence and control. History tells us leaders rarely give back powers once they claim them. And yet, some Burkinabe argue, what good is an independent commission if it is dependent on foreign funding? For them, the bigger threat isn't Traoré's grip, but Brussels' wallet. There's a personal story that captures this dilemma. A market woman in Ouagadougou explained to a journalist, "When foreigners paid for elections, my vote never changed anything. When Traoré says no more, maybe it will still not change anything. But at least the mistake will be ours, not theirs." Her words sting because they reveal a truth most nations hide. Sometimes people value ownership of failure more than the illusion of shared success. And this is where the human element matters. People, whether in Africa or America, crave agency. According to surveys, most citizens would rather accept imperfect systems they feel are theirs than perfect systems imposed by outsiders. Think about it. Americans still trust local juries even when verdicts are flawed, because at least the decision came from neighbors. In Burkina Faso, the instinct is the same. Better to stumble on your own than to be carried by someone else's leash. Still, there is danger in this path. Cutting off the referee doesn't guarantee a fairer game. It only ensures that one player holds the whistle. If human beings are tempted by power, and if history suggests leaders rarely step aside willingly, then Burkina's gamble could either be a declaration of independence or the first draft of a new dictatorship. And just as the nation grapples with that choice, another reality intrudes. Even as sovereignty is reclaimed on paper, the material needs of health, education, and survival force African states to reach out for help from powers far richer and far less innocent than they appear. Aid is supposed to heal, but sometimes it chains. Zimbabwe just received $700,000 worth of medical equipment from the United Arab Emirates, celebrated as humanitarian assistance to boost emergency care. On the surface, it looks like a lifeline. Beneath, critics see a leash. A country battered by sanctions and economic collapse is once again leaning on outsiders to patch its wounds. This is the paradox Africa lives with daily. Independence is loudly proclaimed, yet survival often depends on external generosity. In Zimbabwe, doctors and nurses are highly trained, many of the best on the continent, but the economy cannot keep them. They migrate to South Africa, the UK, or anywhere offering better pay. The donation from Dubai fills hospital shelves, but it cannot fill the void of talent drained away by decades of crisis. If you think about it, it's like fixing a leaking roof by buying a new bucket. The rain still comes. There's also the memory of how this spiral began. When Robert Mugabe forced white landowners off their farms in the early 2000s, the backlash from Britain and the European Union was immediate. Sanctions, isolation, exclusion from the SWIFT financial system. For ordinary Zimbabweans, the punishment was brutal. Farmers lost markets, banks froze, and even sending money home from abroad became nearly impossible. One choice, reclaiming land, triggered a chain of consequences that still define the nation today. And here is where the human side bleeds through. A Zimbabwean nurse once told reporters, "I love my country, but I cannot feed my children here." She now works in London, sending remittances back to relatives in Harare. For her, leaving wasn't betrayal, it was survival. For those left behind, foreign aid feels less like generosity and more like dependency cemented with every shipment of supplies. It makes you wonder, do people really want help, or do they want the capacity to help themselves? Most Americans would bristle at the idea of another nation buying their hospitals or stocking their ambulances. Yet for many Africans, that's the only option when sanctions or corruption drain the state. According to surveys, when people face constant shortages, gratitude for aid quickly mixes with resentment at the loss of pride. Humans, after all, need both bread and dignity. So Zimbabwe's gift from Dubai is both blessing and warning. It saves lives today, but risks deepening the habit of waiting for outside solutions tomorrow. Sovereignty is hard to measure. Sometimes it looks like rejecting foreign commissions, other times it looks like accepting foreign charity. And that contradiction sets the stage for the next battle. Not about aid, but about identity, where even the way Africans see themselves in the mirror becomes part of the struggle. Freedom is usually measured at the ballot box, but in much of Africa, it's measured in the mirror. In Senegal, an official tried to ban skin bleaching and fake hair at the National Theatre, framing it as cultural pride. Within 24 hours, backlash crushed the decree. The message was loud. People would rather change their skin tone than have the state tell them what is authentic. It's a strange battlefield. Guns in Burkina Faso, ballots in Zimbabwe, beauty products in Dakar, but each one exposes the same wound. Who really decides what it means to be free? The numbers are staggering. Surveys show nearly 60% of women in major Senegalese cities have bleached their skin at least once. That isn't fashion, it's identity. And identity carries scars. Centuries ago in Louisiana, colonial law forced black women to cover their natural hair with scarves to mark them as inferior. They turned those scarves into symbols of resistance with colors and patterns, so striking that the ban was tightened again. The irony, the same psychology repeats in modern Africa, only this time self-inflicted. What was once imposed by colonial law now survives in bottles of cream and wigs shipped from Asia. There's a story that captures this cycle. A young Senegalese dancer auditioned for a cultural troupe wearing her natural hair. She was told bluntly that she would look more international if she wore a wig. Hurt but determined, she borrowed one. She got the job, but later admitted, "I felt like I left myself at the door." Her experience mirrors the contradiction of an entire continent. Wanting independence, yet chasing foreign definitions of beauty and legitimacy. And this is not just about Africa. Many Americans, too, know the weight of conformity. How many teenagers in the U.S. hide their accents, straighten their curls, or change their names on resumes because they fear rejection? Human beings everywhere share the same weakness, the urge to reshape themselves to fit someone else's gaze. If people in wealthy suburbs can spend billions chasing filters and surgeries, is it really surprising when Africans chase lighter skin or straighter hair? The deeper question is whether sovereignty can survive if self-image is still colonized. Leaders like Traoré say sovereignty means kicking out foreign armies and tearing up foreign contracts. But maybe real sovereignty also means refusing to bleach, refusing to fake, refusing to measure beauty by someone else's mirror. After all, a nation can build power plants, expel diplomats, even abolish commissions. But if its citizens don't believe their own reflection is enough, how independent is that nation really? And so Africa stands in a swirl of contradictions. Soldiers turned farmers, ballots traded for bread, hospitals stocked by outsiders, mirrors filled with imported ideals. Each story looks separate, but together they tell one truth. Sovereignty is never a single event. It's a daily fight, in the fields, in the voting booths, in the clinics, even in the bathroom mirror. And from that daily struggle comes the energy that will shape what the continent dares to become next. So here's the picture we've traveled through. Burkina Faso turning broken fighters into farmers, but also ripping apart its electoral commission. Zimbabwe taking foreign aid that heals today but may bind tomorrow. Senegal wrestling not with ballots or bullets, but with mirrors and identity. Each story different, yet all pointing to the same paradox. Africa rising, while still carrying the weight of outside hands and inside doubts. And maybe that's why this matters to you. Because whether you're in New York, Lagos, Paris, or Johannesburg, the question is the same. What would you trade first? Your bread, your ballot, or your reflection? This is Africa Daily Good News. If you felt this story cut through the noise, hit subscribe now, leave a like, and share it, so more people see what the big networks won't show you. And don't just watch, drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice shapes this conversation as much as the headlines do. And if you're ready for more, stay with the channel. The next video is already waiting, different story, same shock. We won't spoil it here, but trust me, you'll want to see how the chain of events twists next.